The suitcases had been sitting by the bedroom door since Tuesday. 3 of them, George's green one with the football stickers peeling at the corners, Charlotte's pink hardshell that she'd insisted on decorating herself with little star decals, and Lewis's battered navy one that had somehow survived 2 years of royal tours, a camping trip in the Welsh countryside, and what Catherine suspected had been a very ill-advised attempt by her youngest to use it as a skateboard. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at them. There was something about luggage. The promise of it. The weight. A year ago, she hadn't been sure she'd be standing here at all. She didn't say that out loud. She'd learned not to, not because the thought shamed her, but because she discovered that some truths were better held close, turned over quietly in the space between sleeping and waking, pressed against the chest like something fragile and irreplaceable. William knew. He knew the way you know things about a person you've watched fight for their life from 3 feet away. He knew the way you know when someone you love has come back to you, not unchanged, not the same shape they were before, but back, present, breathing, standing in a doorway staring at children's luggage with her eyes going soft. Mum. Charlotte materialized at her elbow, 8 years old and already possessed of an eerie capacity for reading a room. Are you doing the staring thing again? I'm not doing a thing. You're doing the staring thing. Charlotte pressed her small shoulder against Catherine's arm. Warm. Solid. Real. Dad said you did it with his jumper yesterday. Just stood there staring at it. I was checking it for moth damage. It was on his body. Outside the tall windows, the grounds of Adelaide Cottage spread out in the particular gold grey of an English April morning, the tentative, almost apologetic sunlight that doesn't quite commit, that seems to ask permission before touching things. The daffodils had gone full mad all along the fence line. Catherine had planted half of them herself last autumn, on a Tuesday in October when she'd needed something to do with her hands, when the waiting had felt unbearable, when sticking bulbs into cold dirt had seemed like the only honest kind of hope available to her. They were blooming now. She hadn't been sure she'd see them bloom. That thought again. She folded it away. Right, she said, and clapped her hands once, light and businesslike, in the way she'd learned mothers could use to reset the emotional temperature of a room. Has your brother found his other trainer? Charlotte's face arranged itself into the expression of someone who has absolutely no involvement in the disappearance of a shoe and resents the implication. He might have left it in the garden. Charlotte. He was using it as a bird feeder. He was. Catherine stopped. Breathed. A bird feeder. He said the birds needed somewhere to stand while they ate the seeds. Charlotte paused. He'd put seeds in it. The trainer. It was actually quite sweet. Lewis. Her extraordinary, baffling, magnificent youngest child who had spent the better part of March attempting to construct what he'd called a wildlife hotel from spare pallets in the garden and, who had, at some point that she'd apparently missed, repurposed his Adidas as avian hospitality. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. She was laughing. She hadn't expected to be laughing. The laughing felt like something returning. William found her in the kitchen 15 minutes later, standing over the kettle in the specific posture that meant she was somewhere else entirely. Penny, he said. She smiled without turning around. Stop doing that. Doing what? Saying Penny every time you walk in and find me looking at nothing. I'm thinking. You're always thinking. He came and stood beside her, leaned his shoulder into hers. He was already in his weekend clothes, dark jeans, a soft gray jumper, the one she'd apparently been caught staring at on his body. He looked exhausted. He'd been doing more events, carrying more of it while she'd been carrying less, and he never mentioned it and she always noticed. That was the whole marriage, really. Noticing what the other one carried. Trying to take some of it. Neither of them very good at asking. Both of them getting better. I was thinking about the daffodils, she said. He didn't say anything. He poured the tea. He understood about the daffodils. She wrapped her hands around the mug he handed her and looked out at the garden, where Lewis could now be heard having a detailed conversation with something in the flower beds, unclear whether it was a bird, a frog, or his own reflection in the garden tool left leaning against the wall. George was somewhere upstairs, having reached the age where Easter getaways require approximately 45 minutes of preparation time, during which he will insist he needs none of it. Charlotte had gone to supervise, which would make everything worse. "I want this one to count," Catherine said. William looked at her. "Easter," she clarified. "Not that she needed to. I wanted to actually, I want to be present in it. Not managing it. Present." He nodded slowly. There was something careful in the way he was looking at her, the particular care of a person who had spent a year learning to hold hope at a specific angle, the way you hold something hot close enough to warm you, careful enough not to burn. "I know," he said. She turned to face him fully. He had lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. She suspected she did too, though she decided somewhere around month 3 of treatment that she was done inspecting her face for the evidence of what she'd survived. She wore it. It was hers. "I mean it this time," she said. "No checking the phone during the egg hunt. No slipping away for calls. The children have grown an inch each since January, and I have missed approximately 640 small moments worrying about large things, and I would very much like to stop missing the small things." He put his mug down. Then, he reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and his hand stayed there a moment, at the side of her face, in that way he had that meant approximately 10,000 things and required none of them to be spoken. "I'll leave the phone in the car," he said. "You won't." "I'll leave it in the bag in the car that I'll pretend I'm not thinking about." "That," she said, "is the most honest thing you've said all week." He laughed. Really laughed, head tipping back slightly, the laugh she'd fallen in love with at 20, that she'd heard go quiet during the long months of 2024, that she'd been listening for ever since, that particular laugh, his specific laugh, the one that only happened when he wasn't watching himself. She'd missed it. It was back. So was she. The cars came at 9:30, the small, quiet convoy that had become the template for their family travel since the decision to downscale the visible security footprint, to try to give the children something that resembled a normal departure from a home they could actually call home. George came down the stairs with his bag over one shoulder, 14 and, already wearing the careful composure that made Catherine's heart clench, this boy who had learned so young to be watched, to be looked at, to represent something larger than himself. He was taller than her now. Had been for months. She still wasn't used to it. "Morning," he said. "Morning, darling." He let her hug him. Just for a second, a compact, efficient sun hug that was over before she could fully appreciate it. She appreciated it anyway. Louis descended next, with no bag, in one trainer, having apparently decided that the other could remain on wildlife duty while he attended Easter in a single shoe. He was negotiating this position with considerable confidence. "I only need one," he said. "Louis. The left one is comfortable. The right one is where the birds are." "The birds," Catherine said carefully, "will find other arrangements." Louis considered this with the philosophical gravity of a child who has thought deeply about birds and their accommodation needs. Charlotte appeared behind him, holding the trainer in question at arm's length with the expression of someone handling unexploded ordnance. "I got it," Charlotte announced. "It had a worm in it." There was a worm, Louis confirmed, with some pride. William, coming through with 2 bags and his jacket, looked at the trainer, looked at Louis, looked at Catherine. She looked back at him. They said nothing. 22 years of knowing each other, 18 married, 3 children, 1 year of the worst kind of fear, and 1,000 ordinary Tuesday mornings stretched between them, they said nothing at all and understood everything. "Into the car," she said. "The worm stays home." The Sandringham estate received them the way it always did, all that flat Norfolk sky pressing down, enormous and pale and unhurried, the kind of sky that reminds you that you are very small and the world is very wide and most of what you worry about is smaller than you think. Catherine had spent 6 weeks in the Norfolk countryside during the worst of her treatment. She didn't speak about that time in public, it belonged to her, privately, completely, but she carried it with her the way you carry a scar, not visible, not forgotten, part of the geography of who she was now. The landscape knew her differently than it knew the world. She'd sat in it at her lowest end, it had held her without asking anything. trees and fields and that enormous sky, doing nothing, being nothing, asking nothing, and, somehow, inexplicably, helping. She understood now why people drove into the countryside when they were breaking. Why the natural world could absorb grief in ways that rooms couldn't. The house was full by early afternoon. Her parents had arrived. Pippa and James, the children. The beloved chaos of the Middleton family Easter, which operated on entirely different principles than royal Easter, louder, less organized, considerably more competitive when it came to the egg hunt, and prone to producing at least one moment per gathering where someone said something so genuinely funny that Catherine's mother had to excuse herself to recover. Catherine's mother, Carol, had barely put her bag down before she had Catherine's face in her hands. "Look at you," she said. Not a question. Not quite a statement. A mother looking at a daughter who had frightened her very badly and had come back. That was all. That was everything. Catherine held her mother's gaze and didn't look away. "I'm here," she said. Simply. As a fact. As the best fact she had. Carol pulled her in, and Catherine let herself be held the way she had been held during the months when holding had been the only thing that made sense, when the days had contracted to something very small and the nights had been very long and her mother had sat beside her and simply been there, ordinary and irreplaceable. "You look well," her mother said against her hair. "I feel well. Really well. Properly well. Mum. I'm allowed to say it twice. You've said it 14 times since January. I'll keep saying it until I stop needing to." The egg hunt began at 3 o'clock. The rules, as established and aggressively defended by Lewis over the past several years, were as follows: the eggs were hidden across the full garden, the Westfield, and the Rose Terrace. There was no age category handicap regardless of what older participants suggested. Anyone caught checking the location of someone else's eggs would be disqualified with immediate effect, and the prize for the most eggs was supreme bragging rights until the following Easter, which Lewis had discovered mattered more to everyone than any actual prize. Charlotte, who had an almost supernatural gift for finding things, eggs, missing shoes, the emotional temperature of a room, began to pull ahead within the first 10 minutes. George was taking it less personally than previous years. This was either maturity or a very sophisticated tactical retreat. Lewis was somewhere in the Rose Terrace conducting what appeared to be a negotiation with a robin. William was crouched at the base of the garden wall, searching with slightly more focus than was probably seemly for a man approaching his mid-40s, and Catherine stood in the middle of all of it with a basket held loosely in her hand and the April sun on her face and just stood there. Not moving. Not searching. Just inside the moment. Actually inside it, not beside it, not managing it from a slight remove, not taking a mental photograph to save for later. Actually here. Actually now. The light was doing something extraordinary to the old stone wall, that specific late afternoon April light that is less about illumination and more about warmth, pressing against things rather than revealing them, making everything it touched feel like it was being kept. She could hear Charlotte calling something across the garden. She could hear her father laughing at something Pippa had said. She could hear William, 20 feet away, saying, "I can see you behind the rhododendron, Lewis, we can all see you," in the voice that still made her feel steadied, still after all these years, like a keel in a current. She breathed in cold green air and something sweet, the early rose stalk, still mostly bud. She breathed out. This moment. This exact moment. The noise and the light and the cold grass under her feet through her boots and the basket handle in her hand and 3 children hurtling around a garden on an April afternoon, alive and loud and exactly themselves. She'd planted the daffodils in October not knowing if she'd see them. She was seeing them. She was here. Her father found her in the kitchen after, while the others were still arguing good-naturedly about egg counts in the garden. Michael Middleton had always had a gift for appearing at the right moment with no explanation for how he'd known it was the right moment. He stood in the doorway for a second, just looking at her. "You all right, love?" he asked. "More than all right." He came and stood beside her, in the easy, unhurried way her father had always moved through spaces, no ceremony, no performance, just a man who loved his daughter and made no fuss about it. She'd always admired that about him. The quietness of it. "It's a good Easter," he said. "The best in a while." He nodded. Looked out the window at the garden where William was now being chased by Louis, for reasons that had not yet been explained. "We missed you," he said. "Last year." She didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't talking about last Easter, specifically. He was talking about the year. All of it. The whole long year of it, when she'd had to get so small, so private, so interior, when the version of her that showed up at family gatherings had been a version made largely of willpower and love and the determination not to let her children see her frightened. When she'd been present in body and somewhere else entirely in the ways that mattered. "I know," she said. "Glad to have you back." She rested her head briefly on her father's shoulder, just for a moment, a small borrowed moment, and, outside, William caught Louis and swung him up and Louis shrieked with pure animal delight and Charlotte pointed at something in the hedgerow and George smiled in the particular private way of a boy who thinks no one is watching. She watched. She was here. That evening, after the children were in bed, Louis first, Charlotte following under protest, George last with his headphones and his adolescent self-containment, Catherine and William sat outside on the old stone bench by the kitchen garden wall. The sky had gone that deep blue-gray that English evenings do in April, not quite dark, not quite light, hedging its bets. Stars were making their first tentative appearances. Somewhere in the distance a church bell marked 9 o'clock. The air smelled of the day just ending. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He had his hands wrapped around a mug of something that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and that he hadn't noticed. They were sitting close but not quite touching, in the comfortable near contact of two people who have spent enough years side by side that proximity is its own language. She'd been thinking about what to say. She'd been thinking about it since Christmas, since the moment she'd sat in front of a camera last January and looked into it and told the world she was in remission, told it in the measured, precise language of a woman who had learned not to lead with hope before the science confirmed it. She'd said what needed to be said and she'd meant every word and she'd gone home and cried in the bath for 40 minutes, not from grief, not exactly, but from the release of it, the enormous release of being allowed to believe it. She was in remission. She was here. The world had kept moving, the diaries had kept filling, the flags had kept flying and the plates had kept spinning, and she had kept going, kept turning up, kept being the version of herself that public life required, and none of it had been false, none of it performance. She had meant her return. She meant every event she attended, every hand she held, every conversation she had with people who looked at her across hospital rooms with the particular recognition of those who know what it is to sit in the same waiting rooms, to have the same sleepless 3 a.m. thoughts. "I know," she had said, in the therapy gym at Charing Cross. She knew. That knowing was different from before. It cost something, knowing the way she knew now. But it also gave something, a quality of attention she hadn't had access to before, a kind of listening that only comes from having been in the places that make you genuinely uncertain about what comes next. "I was thinking," she said. William made a sound that meant I'm listening. "About next year." She paused. "About, I don't know. About all of it. The garden shows. The hospital work. The art programs. There's so much I want to do, and I also don't want to." She stopped. Searched for the right word. "Rush back to who I was before." "Because who I was before was running," he said. She looked at him. "You were running before," he said. It wasn't a criticism. It wasn't a reproach. It was just a thing he'd noticed, had always noticed, and had never quite found the moment to say until now, on a cold stone bench in the near dark of an April evening. "You never stopped. You were brilliant and you were dedicated and you genuinely cared about all of it. I'm not saying you didn't. But you never stopped." She thought about this. "I didn't know how to stop," she said. "I know. I thought stopping was," she shook her head. "I thought stopping looked like failing." He didn't say anything. He set his cold mug down on the bench beside him and shifted close enough that his arm pressed against hers and stayed there. "I don't think that anymore," she said. She felt him nod. The small movement of it. "The children," she said then, and her voice did something involuntary at the edges of the word, a thing that happened sometimes when she thought about them from this angle. from the angle of what she corrected her course. George asked me in November. After a school thing. He asked if I was going to be all right. Not sick again. All right. She pressed her lips together. 11 years old and, standing in the kitchen looking at me with those eyes like she stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The sentence finished itself somewhere between them in the dark. What did you say? William asked. Quietly. I said yes. She looked up at the first stars. I said, yes, I'm going to be all right. And, I meant it. And, she breathed. He looked so relieved. This enormous, total, full-body relief. And, then, he just went back to making his toast like nothing had happened. She felt William's hand find hers in the dark. They carry it too, she said. We forget sometimes. The children carry all of it too. They do. So this Easter, she squeezed his hand. I needed this Easter. To just be here. To eat too much chocolate and watch Louis commune with the wildlife and watch George pretend he doesn't want to win the egg hunt when he absolutely wants to win the egg hunt, and listen to Charlotte tell Charlotte's father very firmly what he's doing wrong, and just be here. Be a person who is here. Who got to be here. The night had settled fully now, dark and quiet and cold in the clean April way, the kind of cold that means tomorrow will be beautiful. The church bell had gone quiet. The house behind them was still, that specific still of sleeping children, the heaviest kind of quiet there is. William brought her hand up and held it for a moment against the side of his face. She could feel the warmth of him. The particular warmth that had been there through all of it, through the diagnosis and the surgery and the treatment and the remission and the slow careful return to something that looked like a life and felt, increasingly, like more than that. I'm glad you're here, he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she leaned her head against his shoulder, there on the cold stone bench in the April dark, the blanket around her shoulders, the stars making their full appearance now, the daffodils somewhere in the garden they couldn't see, bright and yellow and completely, entirely committed to being alive. So am I, she said. And, she meant it in all the ways there were to mean it. Not as relief. Not as gratitude. Not as the cautious hope of someone who has been frightened. As a fact. The simplest, solidest, most uncomplicated fact she had. She was here. It was Easter. Her children were asleep in the rooms above them. Her husband's shoulder was warm under her cheek. The stars were doing what stars do, unhurried and indifferent and, somehow, tonight, exactly right. Whatever came next, the events, the engagements, the work she was building toward, the new pace she was learning, the woman she was still in the process of becoming after everything she'd been through, whatever came next could wait. Tonight was enough. Tonight was everything. The Wales family spent Easter at Sandringham, attending the Easter Sunday service, Princess Catherine's first Easter church attendance in several years, before returning to Adelaide Cottage later in the week. Those who saw her during the holiday described a woman who seemed, in the words of one close observer, genuinely, quietly happy. The kind of happy that doesn't need to announce itself. She'd planted the daffodils in October. She'd seen them bloom. That was the whole story.